There's that initial just kind of a little tired and down from the match. That's Alex Eala, minutes after her Toronto run ended, sitting in front of reporters, still catching her breath from a loss that closed out one of the most demanding two-week stretches of her career. No spin. Just an honest, quiet admission of exactly how she felt in that moment. Here's the real story, right away. This wasn't a player avoiding the cameras. Eala sat down and answered every question directly, and what she said reveals something more layered than a simple, tough loss story. Let's set the scene properly, because the context behind this press conference is what makes every word inside it matter more. 6 days before this loss, Eala was lifting a trophy in Washington, becoming the first Filipina in history to win a WTA 500 title. 48 hours after that, she was already competing in Toronto, opening with a 3-set win over Alicia Parks, the player who'd beaten her badly back in January. Then came the third round against Caty McNally, another 3-set battle, 6-3, 5-7, 6-4, one that included a genuine ankle scare in the second set that could have ended her tournament right then and there. She played through it and won anyway. 7 matches, 2 tournaments. Almost no rest anywhere in that stretch. Then Sunday arrived, and Belinda Bencic ended the run with a 4-6, 0-6 result that looked nothing like the player who'd been winning for 2 straight weeks. So when Eala walked into that press conference afterward, she wasn't just answering questions about one match. She was answering questions about an entire physical and emotional marathon, all at once, in real time, with the loss still fresh. The first thing worth noticing is how she opened. Asked directly about the match, she didn't dodge or deflect. "Tough one today," she said. "I think Belinda put me in some tough situations. I think she played really well. I wasn't able to kind of get myself out of a certain mode. That's not an excuse. That's not blaming fatigue or making it about anything other than her opponent playing well and her own inability to find an answer in the moment. It's a simple, honest read of what happened on the court, delivered without any of the drama that usually surrounds a big loss like this one. But then, almost immediately after that honesty about the match itself, she pivoted to something else entirely, something that tells you a lot about how she's actually built mentally. Overall, really good week, she said. I am super happy with the run that I've had, and, yeah, going to try recover and come back out hot. In the span of 2 sentences, she went from acknowledging a difficult loss to reframing the entire 2 weeks as a positive, without pretending the loss didn't happen and without letting it define the whole experience either. That's a specific kind of emotional discipline, the ability to hold both truths at once. This hurt right now, and this was still a great 2 weeks, without one canceling out the other. There's a moment in this press conference that's easy to miss on a first read, but says more about her mental state than almost anything else in it. A reporter asked about the moment she looked up at the crowd while walking off the court, smiling even in defeat. Her answer wasn't about the match at all. I knew it was my last time, the last time that I was going to be out on that court for a while, she said. The atmosphere this whole week has been just incredible. It's hard to describe to other people kind of the feeling of being in that stadium, full of the fans and all the love. Think about what that response actually reveals. In the immediate aftermath of a loss that ended a historic run, her mind wasn't replaying the match. It was processing gratitude, specifically for the crowd, for an experience she knew was ending and wanted to hold on to before it was gone. That's not the response of someone spiraling into disappointment. That's the response of someone who's already, in real time, separating the outcome of one match from the value of the entire experience surrounding it. This connects directly to a broader theme that showed up again and again throughout the press conference: her relationship with her identity and her community. Asked about what she learned about Toronto and its people, she described the city as a mixing pot of cultures and personalities and passions, and specifically called out seeing the Filipino community show up for her, the same way she noticed the Turkish community showing up for another player in the draw. When a reporter brought up the Filipino food being sold at the grounds, the adobo, the lumpia, and her Nike collaboration tied to the Sampaguita, her answer wasn't self-focused at all. I am kind of just like a drop in the ocean, you know, when it comes to Filipinos and their pride for their culture and where they come from, she said. I do a lot to kind of represent my country, and I'm very proud of it. But you see, the stadium was full of people who do the same thing. That's a remarkably grounded thing to say in the immediate aftermath of a loss that ended a personal historic run. Most athletes in that moment default to talking about themselves, their disappointment, their frustration, their next steps. Eala's instinct was to redirect the credit outward, toward her community, toward the people who showed up for her, rather than toward her own performance. That tells you something real about how she processes both success and failure, less as a personal narrative and more as something shared with the people around her. Now let's get to the specific quote your title is built around, because it's worth sitting with exactly what she said and exactly what she didn't say. Asked directly about how she was feeling physically and mentally after playing a lot of emotional matches recently, her full answer was this: "It's always tough, of course, after a loss. But like I said, I'm looking back at these past 2 weeks as a really big positive. I think I've played really well. I've gotten through so many obstacles. Of course, right now there's that initial just kind of a little tired and down from the match. But yeah, I'm healthy, which is something I'm super grateful for." Hand quote. That's a far more complete and more interesting answer than a simple, "I'm tired and sad" soundbite suggests on its own. Yes, she admitted to feeling tired and down in that immediate moment. That part is real, and it's honest. But she wrapped that admission inside a much bigger, much more deliberate framing. This was a positive 2 weeks, she's grateful to be healthy, and she's already thinking about lessons to carry forward into her next tournaments. The tiredness she described wasn't presented as a crisis or a warning sign, it was presented as a completely normal, temporary feeling immediately following a hard loss, one she expected to pass with proper rest. That specific detail about health matters more than it might seem at first. Given everything we've talked about regarding her physical toll across this stretch, the exhausting 3-set battles, the ankle scare against McNally, the sheer volume of high-intensity tennis in such a short window, her specifically naming health as something she's super grateful for reads as a quiet but important signal. She wasn't describing an injury, she wasn't describing lingering physical concern, she was describing simple, ordinary post-match fatigue, the kind that responds to rest, rather than the kind that requires a longer recovery timeline or medical attention. And she was specific about what that rest actually looks like too, in a section of the press conference that's easy to overlook but genuinely reveals her mindset. Asked what comes next, she laughed before answering. "I definitely will take maybe 2 days off, a day or two. I do have to travel to Cincinnati. I need to get a haircut. I haven't gotten a haircut in a while, my nails are grown out. It's a small, almost throwaway moment, but it's revealing precisely because of how ordinary it is." In the immediate aftermath of the biggest emotional low point of an extraordinary 2-week stretch, her actual plan wasn't some elaborate recovery protocol or a dramatic pause. It was getting a haircut, seeing her nails done, reuniting with friends in Cincinnati, and trying to have fun before diving back into the next tournament. "I'll be back on court like that," she said, snapping her fingers. "So I got to enjoy what I have. I got to enjoy the time that I have that I'm not on court." That's a mature, grounded approach to burnout prevention, whether she'd describe it that way herself or not. Rather than treating the days off as wasted time to be anxious about or rushed through, she's treating them as genuinely valuable, worth enjoying on their own terms, not just as a means to get back to competing faster. Given everything we've discussed about the physical toll of this stretch, and the specific way exhaustion combined with her documented serve limitations to produce the benchich result, that attitude toward rest matters. It suggests her team, or at least her own instincts, understand that recovery isn't just about getting back on court as soon as possible, it's about actually stepping away long enough for the recovery to mean something. She also gave a clear signal about where her focus goes next, mentioning both Cincinnati and New York by name, tying directly into the hard-court swing that leads into the US Open. "I'm taking the lessons that I've had from these 2 weeks and hopefully implementing them even more in a better way in Cincinnati and New York," she said. That's a specific, forward-looking statement, not vague optimism, but a direct acknowledgement that this 2-week stretch, wins and loss included, produced real lessons she intends to apply immediately in her next tournaments. If you're looking for evidence that this experience is being processed constructively, rather than as a setback to simply move past, that's about as clear a signal as a player can give in a press conference. One more part of this conversation deserves real attention, because it explains a lot about how she's been able to handle a stretch this demanding without appearing to crack under the pressure of it. Asked about her relationship with her coach Joan, Her answer was detailed and specific, in a way that goes beyond the usual generic praise athletes give their coaching staff. "I think he plays a big part in my development as a player. I trust him a lot," she said. "I feel like we have good energy, good relationship. We're able to be honest with each other. We're able to have an open line of communication. I've worked with him for a couple of years, so, yeah, I admire him a lot, and grateful to have him on my team." Che quote. That specific mention of open, honest communication matters given everything we've talked about regarding scheduling decisions across this stretch. A team that can be honest with each other is a team more likely to have real, difficult conversations, the kind that actually change outcomes rather than simply delay problems. In professional tennis, those conversations are rarer than they should be. The sport runs on momentum, on ranking points, on the constant pressure to be present at every tournament that matters. Coaches and players often find themselves caught in a cycle where the default answer to every opportunity is yes, because saying no feels like falling behind. Saying no feels like weakness. Saying no feels like an admission that something is wrong, and so players push through when they should rest, compete when they should recover, and arrive at the biggest matches of their season, running on empty rather than running at full capacity. What makes her description of her coaching relationship significant is precisely that it cuts against that pattern. She is not describing a relationship built on blind optimism or relentless forward momentum at any cost. She is describing something more grounded and more honest than that. A working relationship where the question of how much is too much can actually be asked out loud without it feeling like a betrayal of ambition. That is not a small thing. That is actually a very difficult environment to build in a sport that rewards relentlessness and punishes anything that looks like hesitation. The fatigue question is central here because of what happened against Bencic. That match was not lost on skill. It was not lost on tactics or on any fundamental gap in quality between the two players. It was lost on legs that had nothing left to give in the moments that mattered most, on a body that had been asked to do too much across too compressed a stretch of competition without adequate time to genuinely recover between efforts. That is a scheduling and management problem as much as it is a physical one. And it is exactly the kind of problem that an honest coaching relationship is designed to catch before it becomes a result on a scoreboard. When she talks about being able to communicate openly with her coach, she is, whether she frames it this way or not, talking about having a system in place that can actually intervene before the tank runs completely dry. A coach who asks the hard questions, a player who answers them honestly rather than performing toughness she does not currently have. A shared willingness to look at the calendar and make decisions based on where the player actually stands, physically and emotionally, rather than where the ranking points suggest she ought to be pushing. That is the foundation that separates teams who manage long seasons well from teams who burn bright early and arrive at the most important tournaments already compromised. Heading into the next stretch of this season, that foundation matters more than almost anything else she could have said. Because talent alone does not win long seasons. Management does. It adds up to a player who is honest about difficulty without being consumed by it. She named the tiredness directly. She didn't pretend the loss was easy, or that she wasn't feeling the accumulated weight of 2 brutal weeks. But she framed that tiredness as temporary, addressed by rest, distinct from her health, which she specifically and gratefully confirmed was fine. That's an important distinction, because it tells us this collapse wasn't a red flag about anything more serious. It was ordinary, explainable fatigue after an extraordinary physical stretch, exactly the kind of fatigue that responds well to a few days off and a haircut in Cincinnati. It also adds up to a player whose sense of identity extends well beyond her own results. Her answers about the Filipino community, about representing her country, about the crowd's love throughout the week, all of that paints a picture of someone who processes this experience as something bigger than personal statistics or rankings. That kind of perspective tends to be protective during difficult stretches, because a player who ties their entire sense of self to winning and losing individual matches burns out faster than one who can hold a loss and a sense of gratitude in the same breath, the way she clearly did throughout this entire press conference. And it adds up to a team dynamic that seems built for exactly this kind of demanding stretch. An honest, communicative relationship with her coach, specific plans for genuine rest rather than rushed recovery, A clear, forward-looking sense of what comes next in Cincinnati and New York. None of that guarantees she avoids another physical wall like the one she hit against Bencic. Nothing in professional sport ever guarantees that, no matter how strong the team around an athlete happens to be. But it does suggest the infrastructure around her, both mental and relational, is built to handle setbacks like this one constructively, rather than letting them spiral into something bigger. Think about what that infrastructure actually looked like in her own words. She didn't describe her coach in vague, ceremonial terms, the way athletes sometimes do in press conferences, just to fill space. She described trust. She described honesty. She described an open line of communication, the kind of relationship where difficult conversations, the ones about when to push and when to pull back, are actually possible rather than avoided. That matters enormously, given everything we now understand about how this specific 2-week stretch played out physically. A coaching relationship built on genuine honesty is a relationship where someone can say, after Washington, we need to think carefully about how we manage the next 10 days, rather than simply defaulting to chasing every available opportunity without checking in on where the player actually stands. And her own plan for those 2 days off, the haircut, the nails, reuniting with friends in Cincinnati before diving back into competition, wasn't framed as an afterthought either. She specifically said she needed to enjoy the time that I have that I'm not on court, recognizing on her own that this window mattered on its own terms, not just as a means to get back to competing faster. That's not the language of someone being rushed back into action by a team chasing momentum at any cost. That's the language of someone who's been given, or has claimed for herself, the space to actually rest rather than just pause. So here's what I actually want to know from you, because this is where the interpretation of everything she said really starts to diverge depending on how you read athlete interviews in general. Based on everything she said in this press conference, do you think this was simply the honest, ordinary reaction of a tired athlete after a brutal 2 weeks, exactly as she described it herself, in her own words, without any need to read further into it? There's a strong case for taking her at face value here. She named the tiredness directly, rather than hiding it. She specifically distinguished it from health concerns, going out of her way to say she's grateful to be healthy, a distinction she didn't need to make unless it mattered to her to be clear about it. She gave a specific, concrete plan for recovery, not vague reassurance, but an actual description of what the next 2 days would look like. All of that reads like someone comfortable enough in her own skin to describe a hard moment honestly, without dramatizing it and without hiding it either. Or do you think there's a deeper concern hiding underneath the calm, grateful tone she used throughout the interview? The kind of concern that sometimes gets masked by a well-rehearsed, professional media response. This isn't a cynical question, it's a genuinely fair one, because athletes at this level go through extensive media training, and plenty of them have learned to sound composed and grateful in front of cameras, even in moments where something is clearly weighing on them more heavily than their words let on. Some athletes are remarkably good at sounding fine in front of cameras, even when something is genuinely wearing on them, whether that's physical exhaustion deeper than a couple of days off can fix, or an emotional toll from an intense, whirlwind 2 weeks that hasn't fully been processed yet. It's worth asking honestly which version of this you believe you're seeing here, because the answer isn't obvious just from reading a transcript. Tone, body language, the pauses between sentences, all of that carries information that a printed quote alone can't fully capture, and different viewers are going to weigh that information differently based on how much they trust athletes to be fully candid in these settings. Drop your answer in the comments, because I think how you read her tone in this specific press conference says a lot about how you interpret athlete interviews in general, whether you take them at face value as an accurate, real-time snapshot of how someone is actually feeling, or whether you instinctively read between the lines for signs the words don't fully capture, assuming there's always more going on beneath a composed, grateful public statement. Neither instinct is wrong on its own. Plenty of athletes really are just being straightforward and honest in these moments, and plenty of others really are carrying more than they let on. The interesting part isn't which instinct is universally correct, it's which one you find yourself defaulting to and why. And keep an eye on how she looks physically and emotionally once she arrives in Cincinnati, because that's really the next real test of everything she said here, more revealing in some ways than the press conference itself. Words can be managed and shaped for an audience. Performance on court, especially performance under the exact same kind of physical demands that produced the Bencic collapse, is much harder to fake. If she comes out sharp, rested, and playing with the same freedom she showed across Washington and most of Toronto before fatigue finally caught up to her, moving well, serving with whatever confidence she can generate within her own limitations, competing point by point the way she did against Pegula and Parks and McNally, that confirms this really was exactly what she described. Ordinary tiredness, the kind that a few days off, a haircut, and some time with friends were always going to fix. Nothing more complicated than that. But if the same patterns start showing up again in Cincinnati, a good start followed by a physical fade in the same shape we saw against Bencic, a competitive opening set giving way to a sudden, unanswered collapse later in the match, that's when this quiet, grateful press conference starts looking like something more than a simple post-loss reflection. It starts looking like the first honest warning sign of something that needed more attention than 2 days off in Cincinnati could actually provide. A signal that got delivered calmly and gracefully in front of reporters, but that maybe deserved a longer, more deliberate response than the schedule was built to allow. Either way, we won't have to wait long to find out which version of this story turns out to be true, and whatever happens next will tell us far more than any single quote from this press conference ever could on its own.